Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Good evening. Welcome to the Planning Committee meeting of January 8th, 2018. Just going to do a quick roll call. Councillors present this evening. Councillor McMillan at my far left-hand side. Councillor Pachariva. Councillor McPherson. Mayor Easton. To my right, Councillor Foster. Councillor Rinjima. Councillor Bernay. Councillor Timbers is sending her regrets for this evening. Councillor Rinjima will be sitting in on her behalf this evening. And, excuse me, staff we have with us this evening. To my far left, I have Matt Bruder, who's the Associate Director of Planning and Development. To my right, I have William Kalasa, who's the Director of Corporate Services and our clerk. In the back row, I have Julie Kirkulis, Legislative Coordinator, and Deputy Fire Chief Bill Blake, and I have our Economic Development Officer, Paul Deaney, and Walter Neubauer, who is our Manager of Technical Services. And at the far end of the table here, I have the CAO, Michael Kirkopoulos. Are there any declarations of interest this evening from the committee? Seeing none. Confirmation of the agenda. There's only one item on the agenda, so hopefully we can keep that intact. The purpose this evening is for a public hearing. I'd like to welcome everybody present this evening for the public hearing section of the Planning Committee agenda and advise the following. The purpose of public hearing is to receive comments from the public regarding the draft Prudhoe Secondary Plan, Staff Report PL 1801. Any questions that arise will be dealt with in the final report, and staff will follow up if required. The Planning Act requires that before passing an official plan amendment, Council must ensure that sufficient information and material is available to understand generally the proposal being considered, and Council must hold at least one public hearing for the purpose of giving the public an opportunity to make representations regarding the proposed amendments. The Planning Act also requires that Council advise the public that the OMB, Ontario Municipal Board, has the power to dismiss an appeal if an appellant has not provided Council with oral submissions at a public meeting or written submissions before any official plan amendment is adopted. If you wish to be notified of the decision, you must make a written request to the town's clerk. Over there is an attendance list by the door for each of the public hearings, which we'd ask everybody here to sign. Everybody signing the list will automatically receive notice of Council's decision. Members of the public who come forward to speak during the hearing are also asked to state their name and address and spell your surname for the official record. We stress that at this point, no decision has been made, and Council will take any comments received into account in their consideration of this item. After the public hearings, a recommendation report will be prepared by the Planning and Development Department, which will be considered by the Planning Committee at a future committee meeting. If approved by Council at that future meeting, a notice will be circulated to all that have registered with an appeal period identified. This evening we have one public hearing. The hearing is for the purposes of considering the draft Prudhoe Secondary Plan. I would ask staff member Matt Bruder, the Associate Director of Planning and Development, to come forward and make his presentation. And while he's doing that, I'm going to ask the CAO for some comments.
Through you, Mr. Chairman. I just wanted to provide some brief comments as Matt does get ready to give this presentation. Matt's our Associate Director of Planning and Development and has really been the lead on this project for over a year to get us to this point. I think more than any other project, this is one project that has been cross-departmental. Everybody from our community services group to our public works and technical services to economic development at some point in time has been involved in this particular project. This is also, I think, one of the largest and most foundational projects that this community and we will deal with in a very long time and have dealt with in a very long time. I also want to acknowledge some of the people that are here today. We've got regional planning staff, Rito Mustachi and Kirsten, that are here that have been instrumental in getting us here, so I did want to acknowledge them. The Victoria Shores Neighborhood Association, who have come out very strong this evening. Ted, as the chair of that executive board, has met with staff and council over the last, I'm going to suggest, year and a half since this project came forward, and has been a strong advocate in terms of what was important to the residents of Victoria Shores, and I hope what you see tonight is a culmination of those voices and those concerns. Town staff, as I highlighted, the folks that are sitting behind me, and of course I'd be remiss if I didn't mention the developer who's been here, who has been willing to sit down with us. There's been a lot of toing and froing, a lot of pushing, a number of consultants that they've brought to the table. We've had consultants in MMM and the planning partnership as well that have been here. So what you see before you is a culmination of almost 2 years of work. I will turn it over to Matt, who will take you through a very extensive presentation, and then from a staff perspective, we can answer any questions and then turn it over to the community.
Certainly. I'm going to actually just add a little tidbit, if that's okay, Matt. The Prudhome's secondary plan is within the current official plan, which was approved in 2006. The plan had envisioned a concentration of commercial land uses supported by the development of medium and high-density residential housing. It was approved prior to the implementation of several important planning initiatives that address increasing growth targets and guide corresponding development, including the 2014 Provincial Policy Statement, or PPS, and the 2017 Provincial Growth Plan for the Greater Golden Horseshoe Places to Grow Act. So with that sort of preamble, please go ahead, Matt.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and good evening, everybody. I've developed this presentation to take you through some of the, just give you a brief overview of the background and then some of the key aspects of the draft secondary plan for Prudhome's. But before I do that, I just wanted to provide a little bit of context with respect to some of the overall planning guidance legislation that we have here at the town. So I just wanted to touch upon the official plan and its purpose, and that is that it's the roadmap to guide long-range land use and development for the town. And how a secondary plan fits into that is it provides a little bit more detailed guidance on a specific area with respect to land use, public spaces, building heights, environmental protection, and roads and parks. It's not meant to be something to look at from a kind of a more detailed point of view. It's a guiding document. It provides direction on how to develop a particular piece of land. Once we get past having the secondary plan finalized, there'll be an opportunity for landowners to submit development applications where, again, we review in kind of a little more closer detail, you know, the types of planning as it relates even more specific to a specific subdivision or even building or what have you. So there'll be further opportunities at that point to review certain things, whatever they may be, impacts to adjacent residences or, you know, access, things of this nature. So I just wanted to highlight that moving forward. Just a little bit of redundancy here, but a brief background. As Chair Thompson said, the initial secondary plan approved in 2006 is currently within our official plan, and I won't go through all the points here, but I will note that they are relatively similar to what we're trying to accomplish in this updated secondary plan. But I mean, the need for an update was identified based on some key changes in the planning climate in Ontario. One of those is a forecasted growth. As you can see, over the next 15 years, 12 million people are expected to be within the Greater Golden Horseshoe, whereas there is currently 9 million. So that's a big change, 3 million in 15 years. So that necessitates us to look at planning a little bit differently, look at, more compact built forms that make better use of infrastructure, and while still maintaining the goal of preserving farmland, preserving resources. To further that, as a result of some of the growth that's anticipated, there's new planning legislation or updated planning legislation that's been released, in particular the provincial policy statement and the provincial growth plan. The provincial growth plan sets targets for growth up to the horizon year 2041. In Niagara, there's anticipated to be a growth target of 168,000 people. So that's a significant amount. Again, both of these provincial policies and their updates require us to look at planning in a more compact built form, especially where we are here. There's the Greenbelt Plan, the Niagara Escarpment Plan. We don't have many places where we can grow, so we need to focus these where we have infrastructure in place, where we have an opportunity to efficiently use land. So the plan vision for the new secondary plan, it serves to include updated policies to address the current policy framework, urban design practices and market trends, and provide for development which better accommodates the projected growth in Niagara. Some of the main primary components of the vision that are anticipated for Prudhome's is one of them is being a central Main Street featuring buildings that terminate at a waterfront park. This is kind of the central terminus of Prudhome's. This is the sense of place, the gathering area, if you will. A well-designed and connected community, that's taking into account the town's got urban design guidelines. We want to make sure that this is a place that's desirable to visit and desirable to live. It provides a range of land uses and is connected. So, in terms of providing linkages, pedestrian, motorists, what have you. We also want to make sure that we have a connected system of natural features. We're along, the Prudhome's Landing is along 3 kilometers of Lake Ontario waterfront. So there's a real priority to make sure that, we maintain that natural linkage along the waterfront area. Height strategy, this is something that we've carefully considered to try to transition from the existing neighborhoods, transition where it's kind of lower rise on either end, on the east and west ends of Prudhome's, and then getting higher towards the center for the most part. We want to provide a public open space network. It's connected, like I said, to these natural features, but it also provides, amenities for the public to gather, to be physically active, socially engaged. I mentioned active transportation, and then another thing that we want to make sure that we achieve is, looking towards the future, we want to make sure that this development is transit ready when the time comes. So objectives to achieve a successful community, the first of which is a complete community. That's providing a range of amenities that meets an individual's daily needs, whether it be employment opportunities, shopping, social services, what have you, just to make sure that there's an opportunity really to age in place, to provide a place where, nobody goes for wanting, so to speak. There's all the required amenities. When we talk about quality, we talk about, the good design of the buildings, the streetscapes, the open spaces. We want to make sure they're highly functional, but at the same time, they're cost effective, they're efficient. Healthy community, that's when we talk about, again, trying to plan the community in kind of a pedestrian-oriented manner. So people remain physically active as much as possible. They're socially engaged. We're getting them out of their homes. They're walking. They're conversing with each other. Sustainability and resiliency. That speaks to the need. We've had some very inclement weather. There's a good chance that could continue. We got to make sure we're resilient to that in how we design our services, our infrastructure, our buildings. Sustainability in terms of looking at maybe LEED design for the buildings, low impact design. When you're talking about rainwater collection, you're talking about porous pavement potentially for sidewalks, things like that. And then viability, we have to make sure there's flexibility in the secondary plan policies to respond to changing market conditions that might happen in the future. So that's something that we've also endeavored to keep in mind. So the process to date, there's been a significant amount of consultation. One of the main things, you know, there was a kickoff presentation before we even had a concept plan to identify 3 design concepts, which is a good approach because moving forward, that means there's been input incorporated since day one. I won't go over all the specific items listed here, but there's been public meetings, there's been charrettes, there's been presentations before to council. Now we're at the point, now we're at the public meeting, and there's also been dialogue with the landowners because obviously, you know, we have to try to, you know, we have to make sure that we look out for what's best for the town, but at the same time, we need to provide flexibility in the policies as much as possible as well and work to compromise if required. So I'll go into now some of the key components of the secondary plan. First, we've got land use, compact build form, and building heights. As you can see on this plan here, we've got kind of our lower rise residential towards Victoria Shores community at the west end there. That's 2.5 stories in there, and then the blue area is employment lands there, right in here. That's 3 stories, and then we've got this natural buffer here that's going to be approximately 12 to 18 meters wide, depending on where you are in here, and that's to provide an appropriate transition, so it's not you know, these existing residences all of a sudden have these big, massive buildings in their backyards. And then moving towards the east in this direction, we've got, it goes a little bit taller in our mid-rise areas here. That's, you know, you're looking at your stacked townhouses, your kind of your low-rise apartment buildings. There's 4 stories in there. Then we move into 6 in here, 8, and then you've got 10 to 12, and eventually all the way to 18 in here. We've got commercial mixed use along the service road here, typically of a larger nature. So those, you know, businesses can take advantage of the visibility from QEW, kind of provides a little bit of a barrier from the QEW into the more residential and Main Street area. Then we've got Main Street mixed use in here, which is intended to provide much smaller commercial units. Those are, you know, to create more vibrancy within the downtown or the Main Street area. Again, to, you know, promote people to shop and dine there and what have you. And then moving further to the east, we've got another high-rise 18-story proposed max development here. We've got some further mixed use, and then again we get back down into 2.5 stories on the east end. The road and trail network is shown here. As you can see, there's quite the network. It is very pedestrian oriented. We've got our collector roads here which provide access into the kind of the residential areas and connect to the waterfront promenade, which goes along here, and Main Street in here. It's important to note that the road network is not set in stone. There's flexibility built into the policy, you know, based on these future development applications. If there needs to be some minor revisions, they'll be subject to review and approval, of course, of the town, but there is some flexibility in there to revise as needed. Another important takeaway here is if you look at this little spot here, this is a proposed connection into the Victoria Shores community. I'll get into it a little more later, but we understand that there's some concern with respect to through traffic coming through here, especially, you know, as this becomes more and more built out, high traffic volumes potentially going through Victoria Shores. So we are going to be looking at ways to mitigate traffic flow, and I'll get into what those might be a little bit later. So when we were looking at the road network too, it's not only just the orientation, but it's also what the right-of-ways contain. we look at, you know, the road network from a complete streets point of view, where what we're trying to do is we're trying to accommodate all users of the roadways. We're trying to accommodate pedestrians, cyclists, motorists of all ages and abilities, make sure everything is fully accessible. And to create, it helps create a sense of place with the street furniture there. I don't know if you can see clearly in this picture, but you've got a patio areas allotment for those, especially along Main Street and the waterfront promenade. They'll be wider. The amenity areas, there'll be opportunities to have this type of development happening within the right-of-way that really promotes vibrancy and adds to the attractiveness of the community. Parks and open space, as I mentioned before, the main park is a very large park that is right at the terminus of Main Street and the waterfront promenade. It's going to be the focal point of that particular area. At the end of Main Street is going to be, or is visioned to be, kind of a centralized plaza, a walkable area that will kind of provide a vista to the park and then the lake in behind it. The park will be, you know, it will allow for active uses, especially in kind of the more southerly part. As you get closer to the lake, we want to kind of retain the naturalized look there and also respect the erosion limit that I'll also talk about a little bit more later on. There's also another park proposed. It's to the east, adjacent to where the high and medium density residential development is and some of the mixed use over there. It's envisioned to be more of a passive park space, not too much in the way of amenities like playing fields and things like that, more hiking trails and nature viewing and things of the like. It's right near the Jordan Road interchange. It's actually this right in here. These are candidate environmental protection areas that were identified during previous investigations. What they are is they've been identified as areas that require additional investigation before any type of development can occur in there. They're identified as significant, and when it becomes time to submit development applications, an environmental impact study will be required to further delineate these areas and, you know, if possible, revise the boundaries, but that can't happen until there's further investigation. So that was the intent of the plan here. It was to provide that protection, but at the same time, if the environmental impact study reveals that there can in fact be a adjustment to these limits, then an amendment to the plan wouldn't be required. So here we have landmarks and gateway features. The major landmarks are obviously the two higher buildings or the two higher developments that are proposed here. We want those to create a sense of place for the development. We want those to be recognizable, you know, from a longer distance. People will use those to orient themselves with prudence. Very important in creating sense of place. And then in terms of gateway features, our main feature is right here where the Main Street and the North Service Road meet, to provide an entrance into the community, again, making it, you know, distinct. That'll involve some architectural treatments of the buildings on that corner, possibly some boulevard treatments, some landscaping, things like that. So during the process, we've received some key comments from stakeholders, and we've identified other key considerations. One, as I mentioned before, was the road connection into existing Victoria Shores. There needs to be incorporation of traffic flow mitigation, which we will be looking into which is the most appropriate. It could be narrowing of the street. It could be adding traffic calming measures to discourage high volumes of through traffic. It could be even flexible bollards. The need for this connection was based on, the objectives of complete community, whereas you want to make sure that there is connectivity, not just for motorists, for pedestrians too. It's better than siloing off adjacent communities and not having any connection. But also from an emergency service point of view, there are benefits, especially if there was an incident on Victoria. You know, if there was a lot of closures, it's always nice to have an alternate access into the community as needed to minimize response time. So we'll be there will be some type of mitigation incorporated. We'll just be continuing to try to identify what that will be out of the options I mentioned. The western access off the North Service Road and general site accessibility. As I mentioned before, there is some flexibility in policy for some changes to the road network. The particular access close to the interchange, that one, we've included some, or we will be including some flexibility as well. It could end up being more of a kind of a access into that large employment area, and then possibly with a connection on the other side into the community. Those are one of the options that we're still considering. But as I mentioned, the access points, the Main Street one is very crucial, but the other two, there might be some flexibility moving forward. Protecting the natural environment. We've heard loud and clear that, you know, this is a beautiful area. You know, it's well vegetated. There's wildlife habitat present, and a key objective moving forward is going to be to incorporate that. We already have policies in the draft secondary plan that speak to tree protection. They speak to at the point of development applications, if further trees need to be removed, the town can implement a replacement strategy where, you know, and it's not determined yet, but there could be a ratio of replaced trees incorporated into it at the town's discretion. So that's been built in. Also with respect to, as I mentioned before, complete streets, the policies recommend, you know, street tree plantings in the corridors. We're trying to achieve a mature forest corridor or canopy as much as possible. Building heights, this is one of the things, as I mentioned before, that was very critical consideration. For the most part, we're transitioning with our lowest density at either end. The one exception is at the Vineland Manufacturing, where there's going to be a taller building there. There was some dialogue with the landowner about providing some flexibility. However, we looked at it, and there is the natural area in behind that still will provide a barrier. We're looking at a distance of at least 85 meters from the nearest residence. And when we get to the development application stage, there's opportunities for further evaluation of this. One such thing off the top of my head, shadow and shading study to see how the taller building impacts adjacent residences. That's something that's been done before. So that could be determined at that point. In terms of Victoria Shores, I mentioned before that we've got 2.5 stories of the residential development, as well as the area of the employment area that's 3 stories, and then the 12 to 18 meter vegetated buffer. In the policies in the secondary plan, there's also recommends plantings along that buffer too, to vegetate it more so. In addition to that, typically with residential zoning, in our zoning bylaw, we have rear yard setbacks around 7.5 meters that should provide additional clearance from the existing residences that also have their backyards too. So there's going to be considerable separation between them. Adequate and efficient provision of services. There was a regional master servicing plan that identified the need to upgrade some sanitary pumping stations, one on Laurie. The force main as well. The force main is the portion of the pipe that goes westerly. There's a gravity portion that runs from Prudhome's to the station, and that is currently a 250 millimeter pipe, and it's unlikely that it would need to be upgraded, but in the event that it does, to minimize disruption, there are construction methods that we could consider. There's trenchless technologies that could be implemented. There's also some water main improvements too. They'll be required a water main mostly for fire purposes, fire suppression purposes, running down Jordan Road and then along the service road and into Prudhome's. Just to note too that the regional, the sanitary upgrades will be funded by regional development charges, and the provision of this water main will be funded by town development charges. So some of the constraints identified, shoreline erosion potential. There's a required setback from the top of bank. There is some development shown in this area on the secondary plan schedules, and that's again to provide some flexibility because there's still some further evaluation that needs to be undertaken to confirm the actual setback requirements. However, they can also be reduced by adding in shoreline protection, which would also be done at the development application stage. So that is a constraint that will need to be addressed before any development takes place within that area close to the shoreline. The Greenbelt Special Policy Area, it extends, it's kind of the eastern portion of the plan area is located within protected countryside of the Greenbelt plan. However, in the growth plan, it's identified as an undelineated built boundary. There's already existing zoning in place and land uses that are non-agricultural, diminishing the agricultural value. So there's ongoing dialogue there with the province on, providing some relief, but there is some policy included in the secondary plan to this effect as well. And then there's potential interchange reconfiguration requirements at Victoria. The preliminary traffic evaluations that have been done have identified that, upon full build out, there will likely need to be some reconfiguration. However, up until that point, there is some interim development that can occur that likely won't trigger it. There's still dialogue required with the MTO to solidify this and make sure that we know their position on this moving forward, since it's their interchange. So in terms of next steps, we have the public meeting tonight. We have another one tomorrow. We're going to consider input received from these, and we're going to have another look at the secondary plan accordingly. After we've done that and made any revisions or tweaks that are needed, if any, we'll prepare a staff recommendation report, and we'll bring forward to council for consideration. This could be as early as spring 2018, potentially, depending on input received and what's required in follow-up after this. And then if that recommendation is approved by council, then there would be a notice of approval, and that would mark the beginning of a 20-day appeal period. And it should be noted too that following this, it's still to be completely confirmed, but it's in all likelihood it's possible that regional approval of this is going to be required as well. And that concludes my presentation. I'll be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you very much, Matt. It's a very detailed overview of the whole situation. Are there any questions from committee members this evening? Councillor McPherson?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So through to Matt, with regards to the road traversing into Victoria Shores, how do we decide what that will be, and when do we decide that? What mitigation will happen there?
Through you, Mr. Chair. Well, that's just going to require a little bit further dialogue internally, just to, finalize what the best solution is moving forward. I mean, we have to consider not just the connection needs now, but what about the future as well? There might be a change in the area 10, 20 years down the road. We don't know, but there might be the need, to have this connection in a certain capacity as well. So we just need to kind of have a little bit of a further discussion internally about what that may be. But from what we've discussed already, one of those options that I mentioned in my presentation is likely feasible. I mean, whether it's the narrowing of the street, maybe a combination with traffic calming, just to make it less appealing as a through road, or we go the route of flexible bollards until a time comes where we need, where that time comes down the road where more access is needed. So to answer your question, we'll be identifying what measure we're going to incorporate, obviously before we proceed with a recommendation report and finalizing the plan.
So through you, Mr. Chair, so at that time, there will be a definitive narrowing or bollards or whatever it is, there will be that prior to completing or signing off on the secondary plan.
That's the goal, yes.
Okay. And one other question, if I may. So you mentioned the MTO. So I'm confused as to why, I mean, they know what we're going to build there, right? It's going to be X number of places, and so at what point do they decide that they're going to change the whole QEW access?
Well, that's kind of been the question we've been asking as well, and we haven't been able to elicit as much input as we'd like. So a strategy that we've implemented is we've included a threshold in the secondary plan, and our goal is, as part of the agency review, that they comment on that and they provide their input as to what the threshold is of when they'll require interchange improvements. So up until now, we haven't received direction from them in that regard.
It would just seem through you, Mr. Chair, that it would be decided prior to construction starting. You know, it just seems common sense, or, you know, that would already be done, because I can't imagine a decision post-start of construction that they're going to change the interchange, because that would be a whole project on its own. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Councillor Foster.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. To Mr. Bruder, so the ideas that we've presented within the secondary plan, you know, we've gone through lots of discussions and review of them. The developer came in with some suggested ideas as well. So how do you personally, as our planner, feel that those presentations from the developer, as well as what we're presenting as a secondary plan, do they mesh, or do you see some inconsistencies that might be happening with that?
Through you, Mr. Chair. Yeah, we've had some additional consultations, some staff meetings with them, and we ironed out or meshed out what the inconsistencies were. They had some, they requested some flexibility with respect to some of the urban design standards, with respect to some of the uses in certain areas, and we reviewed those. There were a couple of tweaks made, and now I believe that there is, you know, a large amount of consistency between the two plans moving forward.
Okay, thank you. The other thing, too, is that you presented to us some very interesting statistics regarding growth that's going to be seen. I have to admit I was a little surprised with the provincial one where they're seeing a 3 million increase. That caught me a bit by surprise. But do you see, not only with this development, but do you see pressure going to be put on us with other developments within the municipality? I mean, I know we have a bunch of them already set, but, you know, are we going to see even more pressure for even higher density across the board?
Through you, Mr. Chair, I don't know if pressure is the right word, but I can see that, you know, there will be a significant amount of growth, and I think, you know, we're going to have to make some decisions on where, you know, that growth is going to be allocated and how, because there's only as you've heard many times, you've heard me talk about here, there's only very few places where we can accommodate it. And Prudhome's is kind of, you know, it's a very big land holding. It's one of the few places available that we can really accommodate kind of a more compact built form, if you will.
Thank you. Mayor Easton, please, and then Councillor Rinjema.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Bruder, through the chair to you, I was looking at this document and looking for some real energy behind the discussion around future demands and climate change and what kind of technology would be implemented. And I saw some of it, but I didn't see, I'm not convinced that there's as much in there as there could be, particularly since it could be close to 2 years before we start building. There's a lot of things happening. I really didn't, I didn't see the energy behind that discussion, and I just wondered where you think that's going.
Through you, Mr. Chair. Well, There are certain aspects that recur frequently as themes in the secondary plan. In terms of actual technology, that might come too when we get to the point of, future development applications. But there are some guidance with respect to low impact design, which is a big thing moving forward. We're going to have things like increased, there's going to be stormwater runoff to manage from the development. And there's ways of doing that minimize, impacts to the environment. And those are, there are guidelines that, see that it's looked into in terms, whether it be vegetated gardens serving the purpose of a bioswale, or gray water reuse, or things of that like. Those types of themes are throughout the secondary plan. There's also some consideration when it comes to buildings themselves, looking at LEED accredited buildings. There's a whole section in there. It's a guiding section. It's not a recommended section, but there is guidance that, buildings based on their size, their use, should consider LEED certification, just to incorporate the technology that we're going to need in terms of, heat recovery, in terms of, creating a more livable space, things like that. So I think there are some themes within the secondary plan that speak to that.
Okay, Mr. Chairman, I consider those to be pretty mundane now because we've been talking about them so much. So I expected to see those. I guess I was really looking for something around garbage collection, snow removal, at the very least, to see when you get this level of population in an area such as this, that's going to be pretty self-sustaining. Where are those, where are some of those ideas and things that maybe we don't even know about? This is kind of our opportunity to really design something that's extremely unique. Mr. Chairman, through you to Mr. Bruder, is it fair to say that the provincial government is interested in unique design features, that they are prepared to support in any way this kind of a community as a model for the way other development should take place? Am I overstating that through you, Mr. Chairman?
Through you, Mr. Chair, in terms of design, in terms of overall layout and the type of compact build form that's being brought forward, yeah, I think that's something.
Well, as well as the support of the sustainable elements of the infrastructure.
Yeah, I believe so, yes.
Mr. Chairman, I also just want to make a statement about the way in which the description in the report, which I really appreciated the report. I felt that it flowed very well. It has so many dimensions, so many layers to it. And there is a fundamental vision for this property that we really can't lose sight of, because it is the only subdivision, if you will, that is being designed for property owners, their families, their visitors, as well as substantial additional visitors to the area. And that's very clear. And sometimes when these ideas come forward in a report, they don't seem to get transferred out to the buying public. And so the whole idea here is that we are starting with a clean slate. That was the objective of the charrette, to begin with a clean piece of paper and have input from the public, which we certainly have had that. So I just want to reinforce that the fundamental vision is really part and parcel of what we're approving here, because it is quite unique in its own right. And finally, Mr. Chairman, I want to make reference to the height issues. Mr. Bruder, would you consider that by increasing height, that by decreasing footprints, that with the population that we are anticipating in this subdivision, that we would have more flexibility in terms of property use and the enjoyment that people can have on the property? What would your comment be to that?
Through you, Mr. Chair, I think there's a balance that needs to be struck when you're talking about building heights, when you're talking about how many, what the compact build form looks like. You know, in terms of increasing height, I mean, there's probably some room to increase height. Usually when, you know, you have a more compact built form, the land per unit costs go down to, that sometimes can go a long way to providing more in terms of affordable housing opportunities, better range of housing mixes. In terms of, you know, adding vibrancy to the community, and it really depends, because now, you know, you want to go, you want to get that compact built form, but you don't want to, in my opinion, you don't want to overdo it to a point where there's too many people and it's not enjoyable in the spaces that are provided either. So I think there's a balance to be had there, and I think that's the objective of this plan, to achieve that.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. Councilor Renjamo, please go ahead.
Thank you, Chair Thompson. So my question through you to Mr. Bruder is about particularly the high-rise residential designation. So what kind of flexibility is there within that designation? For example, would somebody there on any one of these parcels be able to build? Well, there's two different designations I'm seeing here. I'm seeing a mixed use and I'm seeing high-rise residential among them all. So what kind of flexibility would somebody who had a high-rise residential designation on their property have in terms of putting commercial use in there as well, or some kind of mixed use?
Through you, Mr. Chair, there is some flexibility included in the policy to include some uses within those high rises that aren't, like, it doesn't have to be exclusively residential. There might be an opportunity. I believe one of the permitted uses in there is even a hotel space within there. You know, there might be an opportunity to provide a mix in that sense. So there is some opportunity to provide something other than residential in those.
Okay, so more specifically, a restaurant, would a restaurant be an allowable use within one of those high-rise designations?
I think it would depend on the situation. You know, obviously they are designated as high-rise residential for a reason, but in order to provide an amenity for, you know, the residents within that, yeah, it might be feasible.
Possibly on the main floor? Mm-hmm. Okay, so I have another question through you, Mr. Chair, if you don't mind. So people that have existing buildings on their property along through this whole secondary plan, if their properties are redesignated to something different, what can they expect in the future for their property in terms of continuing to use their property for what they're using for it now? Are they going to have to change their use down the road? Does it depend on our zoning bylaw? What can they expect?
Through you, Mr. Chair. So they're, like, as long as, you know, they continue their use, they can continue it. This is a long-range planning legislation or document, if you will, as well. It's not something that needs to happen overnight. You know, if they want to continue their existing use, they're able to do so. Obviously, we can't make them change that. But when it comes time that they want to redevelop their property, then that's when they would need to consider the new, you know, the new zoning, the new designation.
All right, thank you.
Thank you, Councilors. Any other questions from committee members? Seeing none. Thank you very much, Mr. Bruder. Appreciate your presentation. At this point, I'd like to call upon those who have requested to speak tonight at this public hearing. Francine Kell, if she's here, please come forward and speak. No, please come to the desk so that everybody can hear you with the microphone. Thank you so much. And please.
Hi. Last name Kell, K-E-L-L.
Have a seat, and that way the audience will be able to hear you.
Okay, sure. Okay, last name Kell, K-E-L-L. We were here last Tuesday, the members, the directors of the Victoria Shores neighborhood, and we brought up some of the issues. We gave you some letters that the community had signed. there seems to be still a whole bunch of unanswered questions after the meeting from Tuesday to now. One, the road. I came away from that meeting with the understanding that that was going to be emergency use only with bullards. Is that not correct?
Yeah, through you, Mr. Chair. Well, I was trying to convey that that's definitely one of the options that we consider, and we are going to, we're going to make sure we implement some mitigation, but I think I also mentioned some of those other measures at the meeting as well, that they could be a potential at least. I mean, I wanted to have some further dialogue in that regard, like I mentioned during my presentation internally as well, before I identified which measure we were going to go with. But I did, correct me if I'm wrong, but I thought that I mentioned that there might be a few alternatives to consider.
Sure, but
Yeah, I'd just like to have the CAO chime in for a moment, if I might.
Through you, Mr. Chairman, and why don't I take a stab at answering that, Francine, because I was part of that meeting as well. And I think one of the comments that you heard me say, and notwithstanding what our planning staff say in terms of their best advice, and I always do take planning staff's best advice, I think we said loud and clear, we heard what the community had wanted. At the end of the day, I think one of the other comments I made is that we will be coming back to council with recommendations in terms of what that would look like. Emergency use only and bollards, I think, was the one we discussed at length, for the majority of the discussion that we had as it related to flow in that particular road, and it would be probably the recommendation that would come to the forefront, but notwithstanding not knowing how council would decide, we can't say definitively. I think the other thing we confirmed and I think said we would do is make sure that we highlighted on the map, and you've seen that in red now, I think very brightly for everyone, that there will be some sort of mitigation there, but notwithstanding not knowing what council's going to do in particular, we didn't have that as a definitive bollards and emergency, but that is, I think, the prevailing recommendation that's likely to come forward. But again, we need to go through the process. Okay. But I think, as I assured you, staff have heard loud and clear the executive and all of the letters that are on my desk in terms of what your issues were, and those will be the recommendations that will be coming forward.
okay.
Just one moment before we move forward in this. I just want to clarify the point of this evening's meeting is to bring input forward.
Right.
It won't be a question and answer type dialogue. It will be submitting information for staff and council to consider before the staff report is brought back. So just moving forward so everybody's clear on where we're at with that.
Okay.
So please go ahead.
And another question. You were discussing the number and the population growth for Niagara, and increasing Southern Ontario, 3 million more people in the area. This is a question. I don't know how to put it any other way. Is there a number for the Prudhome's neighborhood in number of people that will be potentially moving in? Some people had calculated that it could be upwards of 11,000 people.
It's certainly a question that could come back from staff afterward, and then certainly they are noting the questions that are being asked, and they will reach out to you and deal with that. Please continue.
Okay. That's all I have at the moment. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Is there anyone else wishing to speak to this application, in this public hearing this evening? Please come forward. Please state your name and address for the clerk.
My name is Anne Marie Straub, Straub, 3975 Cherry Avenue. My concern is the schools. I don't know if any extra planning's been thought of. It seems to me that some of the schools are at capacity in the area. if there's going to be a 22% increase, well, that's if my calculations are correct. If there's about 22,000 people in Lincoln now, and you're looking at maybe 11,000 more, that's quite a significant increase in the population. I know my grandchildren can't go to the local schools now. They want to go to the Catholic French school, and they're going to have to be bused to St. Catharines. So that's a concern of mine. I don't know where all these children are going to be going to school. And I do have one other comment. If the impact design is supposed to be low, I can't see how 18-story buildings are low impact.
Okay, so thank you very much for your comments. Please refrain from clapping.
Okay,
This is not a performance. This is us gathering input so that staff can put together a report.
Okay, I do have one other comment. It's a beautiful area. A lot of people move down here and live in this area because we appreciate the low density by the waterfront. Once an 18-story building or two of them are built, the view is gone.
Is there anybody else wishing to speak towards this issue? Please go ahead.
My name is Ted Gillespie. I live at 3365 South Shore Boulevard. First of all, I'd like to thank you people for the, Councillor Thomas and Councillor McPherson and Michael and your staff for the time you gave us last Tuesday. I'd like to reinforce the statement that Francine said as well. It really is important to our community, and I know you know it's important, but an emergency road is something that our community has reluctantly accepted as something that would be necessary. At the beginning of this discussion, we were told that there was a need for an emergency road. And the reason for that is there was a problem in Victoria Avenue. And I think we can accept that as a possibility. We don't understand why there's a need for anything more, at this point in time, why there's a need for anything more than an emergency road. We understand that perhaps in the future there could be, but at this point in time, we have no understanding of why there should be more than an emergency road. And certainly I hope Council, when they look at the recommendation and the recommendation that comes from staff, I hope you look at that as a really important issue to us. We did a survey of our community. We submitted, I think it was 120 letters or something that were signed by members of our community just before the Christmas break. We also had a petition that was done in our community signed by all except for 3 members of our community saying they didn't want the road going through there. So I hope you would hear us and please look at that as the important recommendation from us. The other thing I'd like to talk about is the change in the zoning for the where the factory is right now. Originally, in one of the plans back, I think it's 3 plans ago, there was an 8-story building that was going to go there. And then we said that would be really a problem for our community. It would be some shading going on. So it was taken down to 4 stories. Now I noticed the most recent plan, now there's a 10-story building that's going to be in that area. There's a park there that's very well used. There's a beach that's very well used. A 10-story building I'm sure will block the sunshine. You mentioned in your dialogue that the plan was to have low-rise buildings adjacent to existing Victoria Shores. A 10-story building is not a low-rise building as far as I'm concerned, and 85 meters sounds like a lot of space, but it's not very much space between our neighborhood and that neighborhood. And the final point, Mr. Chairman, I'd like to make, there in your constraints, you recognize there were 2 areas that were conservation areas. In your secondary plan, you have those areas as being recommendation to be zoned as 2.5-story buildings. What I don't understand is if it is a conservation area, why is there a zoning on that conservation area for 2.5-story buildings? So those are my comments, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Is there anybody else wishing to speak to this? Is there anybody else here wishing to speak? Please come forward and state your name and address for the clerk. Certainly, we will also allow the developer's consultant to come forward and speak at the end of the public commentary. So,
Patricia Gillespie, 3365 South Shore Boulevard in Victoria Shores. There is two major concerns of mine. One, that Ministry of Transportation doesn't seem to be providing a lot of input, that we should be working with higher reference before coming up with more regional plans. The other concern I have is that you mentioned that there is a behind doors conversation. What we need in Victoria Shores is to be educated. Why are you coming up with these different recommendations for the plan? We obviously don't like some things, but you're not telling us why we're wrong. If we're educated, why you are arriving to a 10-story building in Victoria Avenue, at the foot of Victoria Avenue? Is there any model that we're planning this behind? I would like to see it because it really will project shadows and shade in that park all afternoon. I would like to know if we can be present at the time that this plan will be voted so we know who our representatives are. That's it. Thanks.
Yeah, Mr. CAO, did you want to comment on the process a little bit more so that we have some clarity around that?
Through Mr. Chairman, I think to answer Mrs. Gillespie's question specifically as it relates to can residents be here when decisions are made, absolutely. I mean, we will make sure and continue the lines of communication with your executive and anyone else who has left their email here with us to make sure that any future meeting dates are shared and any information that we can share with you is absolutely shared. Similarly, if there's any questions leaving here today that we can continue to engage in dialogue on with your executive and then they can share with everyone, we will do so, whether that be population numbers and some other things we've committed to providing in terms of coming back. So we expect more information as it comes forward. We're going to listen to what comes tonight. We're going to listen to what comes tomorrow, and again, we'll be reporting back, I think, over the next number of months. I don't want to necessarily put a timeline on staff to report back what they've heard today, but we will be coming back hopefully in February and or March with a report. And again, we'll make sure that that is communicated in terms of next steps to everyone, both who have left their information here and through other means, whether that be the media and whether that be email, newspaper, and so forth.
Thank you very much. Is there anybody else wishing to speak to this tonight? Is there anyone else wishing to speak to this evening? Sorry, Mr. CAO, I missed you there.
Through you, Mr. Chairman, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention one more thing, and I think since the question was posed, and I know tonight isn't a Q&A, so I asked for the chair and committee's indulgence. The number that we're dealing with is probably in the 6,000 to 7,000 residents, not 11 to 12,000. And so I did want to make sure that that's at least shared this evening so that you don't go away thinking it's a larger number. And again, I did commit to Mr. Gillespie and Francine that I would provide that number, and it hadn't had a chance, but Mr. Gillespie should have an email from me about 5 minutes ago, but I've shared it with everybody in the room as well.
Very good, thank you. Please come forward and speak. And state your name and address for the record, please, for the clerk.
My name is Susan Walton. I'm at 3359 Laurie Avenue. And I guess I would say, being on Laurie Avenue, my concern is the sanitary sewers. And it seems a lot of things are going to be going through that sanitary sewer that we now have. And I'm not supposed to ask questions, so I can't ask you how you're going to do that. But it is a concern that it's going to be set up for that in the construction. Does that come before or after?
Councillor.
Actually, I think that's a good question. Can we ask Mr. Bruder how things are planned around these types of things, because there is a pretty solid process that does go into place in deciding sewer and water, et cetera. So perhaps a question to Mr.
Yeah,
Bruder.
that's fine.
Through you, Mr. Chair. So the question is when and how servicing is going to be provided as a result of the development, because I can tell you in terms of the water main and in terms of the sanitary, those improvements will be likely scheduled well before, like at least the RFP and everything will be tendered. There will be work done there before development starts in Prudhome's.
Okay, so can I ask the question, is there going to be more, is there going to be somewhere else that takes care of it, or is it just all going through Laurie Avenue Pump?
Through you, Mr. Chair. With respect to sanitary, not necessarily. There's also going to be another new pumping station just to the east of Jordan Harbor, I believe, so that'll handle some of the effluent from the eastern portion of Prudhome's, as well as the existing development that's even a little bit further east. So there'll be that station as well. And then, yes, there will be upgrades needed for Laurie Ave, and as I mentioned before, so it will need to increase its capacity, and the force main, like I mentioned, will need to be upgraded.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks. Okay, I'm going to ask Angela Bonamici to come forward from IBI. Please go ahead.
Good evening, everyone. As you said, I'm Angela Bonamici with IBI Group. We are the agents on behalf of FBH. They are the landowner of 80 acres, which is adjacent to Victoria Shores. As I said, they own 80 acres with 1 kilometer of waterfront. FBH, with the help of IBI, has created a vision for their land, which is looking to create a complete community. This will include buffers adjacent to Victoria Shores, pedestrian-friendly streets, walking trails, a waterfront promenade, and amenities to make this complete community. They have really tried to balance growing, meanwhile respecting the residents that are existing and future residents. As such, we have had extensive involvement through this process of finalizing the secondary plan. We have attended each and every open house, public meeting. We have worked closely with town staff to ensure that our client's vision can be implemented. We are pleased to say that the recent version of the secondary plan is, we'll say, almost there. Let's say 95%, and we feel that just working with the town, there are a few policies that don't make it 100% able to, but we feel working with the town, we can solve these issues. From the beginning, we have been listening to the concerns of the residents of Victoria Shores because they are our neighbors, and we will address these concerns through our design. Just listening tonight, I just want to make some points that I heard. Regarding the population number of 11,000 people, with our land, it's a balancing act. If you're going to develop, you have to these people are going to have cars, you have to park them, you have to make it accommodating. That number that was thrown out is very large for our area, and what we are looking to do is nowhere close to being 11,000 people. Other thing, talking about views and everything, we are proposing a waterfront promenade, which will allow connectivity for the use of Victoria Shores residents as well. The 2 potential conservation areas are potential conservation areas. There will be EISs done and supplement studies that need to be done to determine if those areas do need to be preserved or if they are not significant. As well, regarding transportation, once again, our design you have to do the proper studies, which are reviewed by town, region, MTO. So any issues that are there do get flushed out through the application process. So that's all. Thank you for listening, and we look forward to working with the town on this.
Thank you. Are there any questions from committee? Okay. All right. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Is there anybody else wishing to speak? Oh, sorry, Councillor McMillan. My apologies.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. You mentioned earlier that it's not a Q&A, but there was a question asked about education and schooling in the area, and I think that it's worthy of a comment tonight, simply because the education of the students is not within our mandate. That is the District School Board of Niagara. And I can tell you from experience of being in education that when a community like ours decides on new buildings that are going into their town, new subdivisions, the school board is given the information. The school board is told all of the facts that we have so that they know the size, they know the population that's going to go into that new subdivision. And then the school board will have to make a decision on whether the existing schools will be adequate for the new student population that is expected, or whether there would be additions to the schools that are already there, or whether they were going to have new builds. So that's simply the school board's decision. It is not our decision, but our job then is to let the school board know exactly what our plans are and what the anticipated population growth is going to be. So that's how that will be handled. Okay? Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just wanted to make that explanation since that the question did come up, and it is something that is beyond our mandate.
Thank you very much, Councillor, and certainly appreciate that commentary. And just so that everybody knows, they are one of the agencies that's circulated with all of the upcoming developments, so they will be in the know on that. Councillor Brunet?
Thank you, Chair. I realize we've talked about this at prior meetings, but you know, with a room full of people here tonight, I think it's really important that we continue the discussion about what Councillor McPherson brought up, and I understand getting in front of the Ministry of Transportation is very difficult, and I realize, you know, we are working with them right now with a threshold so that we can proceed with some development. But every time we do a development in this community, it doesn't matter where it is, whether it's, you know, a 300 lot subdivision, we always hear you know, the disruption on what it does to the neighborhood and to the surrounding areas. So, you know, through you, Chair, I really think it's very important that we continue diligently, and I was wondering through you if possibly the CAO could bring us up to speed on where we are with those discussions with the ministry, because you know, to really think about putting a shovel in the ground, working with a threshold of, you know, 2,000 people, and then, you know, we're disrupting through construction and through construction access, and then all of a sudden we're going to have a 2-year construction period or a 3-year construction period to do the interchange Victoria Avenue. Seems to me to be just, you know, absolutely ridiculous. So I just wondering, while we're at this point in this discussion, if we could just really have an update through you, Mr. Chair.
Certainly, I'll go to the CAO for that.
Through you, Mr. Chairman, just to, I think, echo what Associate Director Bruder highlighted earlier. We have tried to reach out and continue to try to reach out to some of our more local counterparts as it relates to MTO and some of their Niagara and St. Catharines offices. I think what we need to do from a next step perspective is actually elevate that and make sure that we're trying to get and force a response in some ways from MTO on this particular matter. So the dialogue will continue. I think for those of us that have worked with the MTO, it is incredibly difficult to get a response from the MTO, probably one of the hardest provincial agencies to get a response. By no means is that an excuse, but I can assure you between now and when we come back, we will make sure that we've got a response from MTO. I think the threshold was a way for us to force that conversation in a lot of ways. It's a threshold that we think we can defend, but nonetheless, it is something that needs to be validated through that agency review. So between now and the next time we're in front of you, we're going to make sure that that dialogue continues and that we're able to provide you some semblance of an update before then.
Appreciate it. Thank you, Mr. CEO. Any other questions from any other committee members? Just a question. Mr. Mustache, do you have any commentary you'd like to bring, or are you okay? I'll just give you the opportunity to have the floor if you wanted it.
Just to thank the town and the staff and the council for moving forward with this initiative. Participants in the process, we sponsored the charrette early on, and that connection between
Thank you very much. Didn't mean to sort of put you on the spot there, but I know that you have a vested interest as the region for this particular project, so I thought it was important. Seeing that there's no one else wishing to speak. Oh, there is one person. Okay. Please come on forward.
Yeah, my name is Nicholas Trach. I live on 2555 North Service Road, last name spelled T-R-A-C-H. Now, in today's meeting, I heard a mention of a new pumping station that's going to be located somewhere to the east of Jordan Harbor or the existing marina. Can you expand on that a little bit, please?
Perhaps Mr. Neubauer can address that, seeing as he's part of our Public Works team that would be dealing with that. Please go ahead.
Through you, Mr. Chair. There's an existing pumping station in the buildings, the commercial buildings east of the development. Currently, the pumping station on Laurie Avenue will service the entire development and does need to be upgraded, so that may have been somewhat of a miscommunication.
Mm-hmm. So this won't be a brand-new, like full-blown, large-scale pumping station that we're talking about?
At this point, we're not 100% sure what the new pumping station is going to look like, but my understanding is that the preferred alternative is to expand the existing Laurie Avenue pumping station.
Mm-hmm. And the need for this pumping station on the east side, would that be to service the land on that side, or the development on the east side of this project?
The pumping station is existing?
No, the one that was mentioned as being a possible proposal.
No, and to clarify, there is an existing station there within the commercial buildings. My understanding is there will be no need for an additional pumping station on the east side of the property.
Okay. Like since I live on the east side, I'm wondering if there will be an extension of services down the North Service Road at all as part of the scope of this?
So certainly we'll, if you wish to liaise with Public Works offline about those additional questions, they will be taking note and they can get back to you and respond with answers for you, for sure.
One last question. The developers on the east side, are any of them present here that could give us some vision as to what they want?
I don't believe there is anybody here representing them this evening, past the FBH lands. So, am I correct in that assumption, Mr. Bruder? Okay, yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. Oh, one last thing, timing. I think we're all interested in timing, right? Like, best case scenario, when could we expect things to start, like the shovel going in the ground and so on?
I can let Mr. Bruder address that.
Yeah, through you, Mr. Chair. There's still some variables. I wouldn't want to give anything firm in terms of a timeline, but, if everything did go, well at this point and we moved efficiently in the process, I think after this, you got to remember too, after the secondary plan gets adopted, then there has to be development applications, plan to subdivision site plans. They can take, 3 months or more. So, I mean, if everything went absolutely, really well, there could be potential that it could start in 2019. But like I said, there's a lot of variables still.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you. Is there anybody else wishing to speak this evening? One last time, is there anybody else wishing to speak this evening? Seeing nobody, I declare this evening's public hearing closed for this evening. We will deal with the preliminary report regarding the Prudhoe secondary plan following the second public hearing tomorrow evening. Once again, that's tomorrow evening at 7 o'clock. We don't have any delegations this evening. We have no correspondence this evening. There are no reports this evening. Any councilor inquiries this evening? Seeing none, there's no notices of motion this evening. We have one announcement, that is that there is a second public hearing regarding the draft Prudhoe secondary plan, which will be held tomorrow at 7 p.m. here at Town Hall. There are no closed session items on this evening's agenda, and being no further business, I'm calling this meeting adjourned.
What's that?